In our last episode, we finally met Henry Evans, the man who gave us the book and gave us the memento mortem. And we learned his fate. He, along with 3 others, escaped to Africa. A few sailors got sick having picked up an illness at a Lascar house. The butcher killed a cow, and we found an incredibly important scene that allowed us to group together many of the sailors, which will allow us to more easily deduce their identities later. But then our memory trail ended. Our corpse gave up its last ghost. Heading back up to the gun deck, we explore until we reach the bow of the ship. There we find that a new ghostly door has opened to us. Heading inside, we find a small exterior deck, and lying on the floor are human bones. Taking out the memento mortem, we can explore the memory. This poor man was crushed to death by the Kraken while relieving himself. I guess this was the ship toilet. And we see that this was none other than Edward Spratt, the ship's artist. Heading inside, we see steward Paul Moss, who gets killed later on. He's grabbing some food. He turns towards the commotion, but as of yet, no one else on board knows what's about to happen. We see a number of men sleeping in hammocks, and heading towards the stern of the ship, we find third mate Martin walking with a young man. And the young man is wearing what by now should be a very familiar uniform. Chapter 7, The Doom, Part 2, On the Bow. So we get teleported way into the future. We are back in the Doom chapter, a chapter we didn't get to finish last time because we ran out of bodies. Looks like we can put together some of the final pieces to this chapter's puzzle. We've already identified this man. He is the ship's artist. He signed his initials. We saw him in an earlier memory while he was sketching the Justice at Sea sketch, and now we know his fate. He was crushed by a beast in the most humiliating way possible. Well done. 3 more fates correct. But we didn't have a whole lot of time to explore, so back in the memory, we can take the stairs up topside to see who else is in this scene. Our man in the turban is looking out to sea. 2 other men are attending to a third man who's kneeling over a bench. What is he? Sick? He's motionless. Did they attack him? But neither of these 2 men appear to be violent, one of whom is wearing an officer's hat. Then heading downstairs to the gun deck again, we find 2 men eating dinner at a table, both of whom we recognize. And hanging above them are 2 hammocks, number 41, but the other one is hanging loose, and therefore we can't see its number. This is a welcome scene because it gives us 2 identities. In our last video, we saw these hammocks hanging up in the past, towards the beginning of the voyage, and at that time, many more of the sailors were still alive. But here we are in Chapter 7, The Doom Part 2, and the crew's ranks have thinned a bit. For example, in our last video, we learned that many of the Chinese sailors were bunking together, with one exception. We saw 39, Ji Zhang, 40, Li Hong, 41, Wei Li, 38, Huang Li, and 59, George Shirley, all hanging together. But in this scene, we find 2 hammocks left. One is 41, Wei Li. But sitting at the table, we only find 1 Chinese person. Now we know what he looks like, and at last we can identify him. Number 41, Wei Li. The other person is clearly not Chinese. Since all of the sailors bunking together in this section were Chinese except for one, number 59, George Shirley, then even though we can't see the number on this hammock, we can still identify this man as George Shirley because he's not Chinese. This completes the fate for George Shirley because we discovered how he had died in episode 2. Killed by a cannon. And if we were paying attention, we can also solve the fate for Wei Li, but we'll come back to that in a moment. So we now have 3 Chinese topmen left to identify, but with no other faces attached to hammocks, we'll have to move on for now. Next, there was third mate Martin walking with this young man. To deduce this man's identity, we need to pay close attention to the uniform that he's wearing. We've seen this same uniform being worn by a number of the sailors on the Obra Dinn, including Paul Moss, who in this scene is getting food. And heading all the way back to our 3rd episode, we recall seeing this uniform hanging from a hanger inside one of the cabins on the gun deck. If we take a look at the ship map, we see that the cabin where this uniform is hanging is the steward's cabin. Well, what exactly is a steward? Cracking open the book's glossary, we see that a steward is a servant to an officer or high-rated crew member, performing general duties for the comfort of their employer. In this scene, we see this man carrying 2 plates of food, one presumably for himself, and the other presumably for the man walking next to him. And the man walking next to him is third mate Martin. We've already seen other people eating on the deck at this time. We know it's dinner time. All of this evidence points to only one conclusion. This young man carrying the plates must be the third mate's steward. Taking a look at our ship manifest, we learn that the third mate's steward is Roderick Anderson. And we know how he died. He was crushed by a loose cannon in our 2nd episode. So we've identified the 1st and 3rd mate stewards, but there's still the ship steward, the captain's steward, the 2nd mate steward, and the 4th mate steward. We could probably pick them out from the Justice at Sea sketch by looking at their uniforms, but to associate a name with each of them, we'll have to uncover more information. Now, turning to the left, we see only 2 hammocks hanging in this section, numbers 56 and 57. 56 is Henry Brennan, whom we've already identified. He was one of the men who attacked the captain at the very end of the journey. And the other is Alexander Booth. This isn't enough information to identify him yet, but it's good to know that this late in the story, Alexander Booth is still alive. That'll become important later. Near to where Paul is getting food, we find 2 more hammocks. One is 43, and the other is 44. 43 is Mamba. We already identified him earlier. And 44 is Lewis Walker. Again, we can't identify him, but the fact that he's still alive this late in the story is important evidence we'll need to identify him later. Then on the opposite side of the ship, we find 3 hammocks. 48, 49, and next to 36 is an unusual-looking sword. 48 is Nathan Peters. This hammock will become important in a moment. And 49 is Lars Linde. 36 is Omid Gul from Persia. And here we have a scimitar. Of these 3 people, who is most likely to use a scimitar? Well, likely Omid Gul. So if we find a guy wielding this sword, we find Omid Gul. Then towards the middle of the ship, we see 1 hammock by itself, number 45. This is Leonid Volkov, a Russian topman. But his hammock hangs alone. Where are all of the other Russians? Is he the only one left? This allows us to deduce his identity. We know that one of the men sitting at the Russians' table gambling that we saw in our last episode was the one whom Emily killed. He tried to prevent Emily, Henry Evans, and the others from leaving the ship during Chapter 9, Escape. But this is Chapter 7, The Doom, a few chapters before Escape. And yet we find only 1 Russian hammock hanging here, which means that the Russian who confronted the people trying to leave the ship during Chapter 9 must be the only Russian we find left on the ship here in Chapter 8. This one is the only one left, Leonid Volkov. Therefore, we can deduce that the Russian whom Emily killed is none other than Leonid Volkov. Well done. 3 more fates correct. With this guy identified, we can use a process of elimination to identify the final Russian. We identified Alexei Toporov in our last video. He was the guy with the pipe trying to kidnap the Formosan royalty. There were only 3 Russians. We just identified Leonid Volkov, which means that the final Russian gambling must be Alarkus Nikishin. And so pulling out the underway sketch, we can go ahead and identify him, even though we do not yet know his fate. And now that we've identified the Russian whom Emily shot as Leonid Volkov, we can finally seal Paul Moss's fate. Remember, in the escape, it was Leonid who killed Paul Moss by stabbing him through with a sword. So we can record that he was killed by Leonid Volkov. Heading up to the deck, we see the 2 men trying to help that overturned fellow. One is wearing an officer's hat, and the other is wearing a steward's outfit. So we know this is a steward and the other guy's an officer, but which officer? At this point, we could probably identify both of these guys through a process of elimination, as there's only one mate we haven't identified yet, but the game doesn't unblur his face until later, so we'll wait until then to identify him. When done with this memory, we can activate the Memento Mortem. Heading topside, oh, this guy wasn't sick, he was dead. What exactly happened to him? Turning around, we can place the body.
Let me on.
Over my dead body, you bloody Dane.
Huh? How's that?
There's no cause for trouble, boys. Get in the boat.
Thought I'd forget. You killed my brother.
What? That was an accident. The ropes.
It wasn't his fault. I saw the whole thing.
Lies. I shouldn't have waited so long.
No, don't!
Ooh, murdered while trying to get into one of the dinghies. This rough-looking sailor with a club smacks the Dane across the face. That's how he died. The officer and steward we saw leaning over his body aren't here in the scene, but we do see a dinghy over the side, preparing to disembark, and 2 men inside it. This able-bodied seaman and this able-bodied seaman. And this guy's carrying something in his arms. Moving around the deck, we don't see anything else, and we can't go below deck, so this scene is easy. 4 people, 1 murderer, 1 victim. Chapter 7, The Doom, Part 1 on the main deck. The transcript here is helpful because the murderer gave us a clue as to the identity of the victim. He called him a bloody Dane. Taking a look at the manifest, we find only 1 person here from Denmark, Lars Linde. And we know that he was alive at this time, or around this time, because we saw his hammock below deck in the last memory. And we know how he was killed. He was clubbed. And we can figure out the name of his killer. He killed Lars Linde because he said, "You killed my brother." Well, then our murderer must share the same surname as someone else on the ship. Taking a look at the crew manifest, there are only 2 people we haven't yet identified that share the same surname. Number 60, Samuel Peters, and number 48, Nathan Peters. Now, we searched every single hammock on the ship in our last memory, a memory that took place immediately after this one, and we didn't find a hammock belonging to number 60, Samuel Peters. But we did find a hammock belonging to number 48, Nathan Peters. Which means that of the 2 brothers, only 48, Nathan Peters, was still alive at this time, which allows us to conclude that number 60, Samuel Peters, died earlier, and number 48, Nathan Peters, blamed Lars here for his brother's death, which means that the killer in this scene is 48, Nathan Peters. But what about the fate of Nathan Peters? We know he's a murderer, but what happened to him? Here's where things get a bit tricky. We are finishing off the Doom chapter right now by exploring the very first 2 parts of that chapter. To understand what happened to these people after they got in the dinghy, we have to go all the way back to chapter 7, The Doom, part 7, the memory where Maba was torn to pieces by the Kraken. In that scene, if you recall, when we looked out to sea, we saw a rowboat being tossed up into the air, and out of the rowboat fell 3 people. That rowboat is none other than this rowboat. Nathan Peters and the 2 other men in the rowboat who watched Nathan murder Lars were trying to flee the ship. But soon after this event, as we learned in the last memory, the Kraken attacked, first by killing Sprat while he was taking a dump, then by attacking the entire ship. While they were out to sea on the rowboat, the Kraken threw them up into the air, tossing all of them into the ocean, which means Nathan Peters was drowned by the beast. Well done. 3 more fates correct. And even though we don't know their names yet, we can record the fates of the 2 other people we see standing in the dinghy. This fellow was drowned by the beast, and this fellow was drowned by the beast. When done, we hear the door open up behind us, and we can leave the memory to the present. Thus completes Chapter 7, The Doom. 9 people died in this chapter, 7 disappeared. We've done a good job identifying many of the people in this chapter, but there are a whole lot of disappearances where we still need some answers. Now, remembering what we just learned from the last memory, that many of these people were cast out to sea by the beast, we can go through each of the Doom memories again to see if we can find a fate for the people who disappeared in this chapter. We'll start with this guy. In The Doom Part 6, we see him falling from the riggings, being cast into the sea, and we don't find him in any memories from this point on. So, like the others, we can say that he was drowned by the beast. Now, as for his identity, he's wearing a turban. Turbans are worn by many different communities, but taking a look at the people on this ship, we only find 2 possibilities. The first is the ship steward Zangisati from India. He's the only Indian we have yet to identify, but we know it can't be him because he's the ship's steward. He should be wearing a steward uniform. But this man being flung into the sea isn't. Also, he's falling from the riggings, which isn't a place where a steward would be. So we need to keep looking. The only other option we find is Omid Gul. He's from Persia, and he's a topman, a sailor who works in the riggings. All of this, plus the scimitar we find hanging by his hammock, I think is enough information to properly identify this guy as Omid Gul. However, his face is not yet unblurred. He plays a role later on, which will further solidify his identity. I really want to find a scene where he's using the scimitar. That will be the smoking gun we need. And so we'll wait to properly identify him in another episode. Flipping the page, we can move to Wei Li, and we saw his fate in Part 8 of The Doom. While the beast was attacking, we saw it wrap a tentacle around Wei Li, who was in the riggings. This can only mean that the beast pulled him from the ship and into the sea. So we can record his fate as being drowned by a beast. Next, we see that helmsman Finley Dalton disappeared in this chapter. We identified him early on. He had his hand on the wheel. That's how we knew he was the helmsman, but we don't recall him disappearing. Well, going back to the Doom Part 8, if we inspect the wheel, we see that the helmsman is gone. But then if we look up, Oh, the beast has him by the leg! This is the chapter where he disappeared. So we can only conclude that the helmsman Finley Dalton was also drowned by a terrible beast. There is one final man who disappears in this chapter, but we don't have enough information yet to identify him, nor to say for sure how he disappeared. Going back to part 8 of The Doom, we see him still alive. He is fighting the beast, sticking a spear into its tentacle. So, since he's not dead at the very end of this chapter, we don't know yet how he dies. However, sharp-eyed viewers will see a clue here that may allow us to identify him early. He's wearing a striped shirt. We'll talk about this more later on when we have some firmer clues to identify him. And this is where our memory trail goes cold. We now have to explore the ship to find more human remains to trigger more memories from the memento mortem. I publish many videos each and every week on my channel, so if you don't want to miss it, be sure to subscribe and to click that bell notification button. If you have and you still feel like you're missing out on YouTube notifications, consider following me on Twitter at Oxhorn. I update Twitter manually with every new piece of content that I publish. I have a shirt shop with completely unique designs that you can't find anywhere else. My designs come on shirts in a variety of men's, women's, and children's sizes, and in a wide array of colors. You can find them on other products as well, like smartphone cases, pillows, posters, mugs, stickers, prints, etc. So if interested, you can find a link to my shop in the description below, or you can click here. If you like what I do and you want to support me in a more personal way, consider becoming a patron on Patreon or a member here on YouTube. But more than anything, I'm just so glad you're here watching this video with me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon with more brand new videos.